The marble steps of Thornfield Manor had been installed in 1847, when the house was substantially renovated by Margaret's great-grandfather. They were famous in Little Hampstead for their beauty and their expense. Italian marble, imported at considerable cost, and installed by craftsmen brought from London. Now they served as a tableau of death. David Ashworth lay on the middle landing, his body twisted at an angle that suggested he had fallen rather than been laid out with care. He was 41 years old, though at present he looked simultaneously older and younger. Older because death had added a terrible weight to his features, younger because his face held an expression of such surprise, such betrayal, that it might have belonged to a man half his age. His left arm was bent beneath him at an unnatural angle, and a thin line of blood had begun to dry along his temple where it had met the unforgiving marble. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the chaos, her small frame somehow making her invisible despite her presence. The guests had surged toward the steps like water finding a crack in a dam. Some were crying out, some were standing frozen. Christopher Ashworth had pushed through the crowd and now stood at the top of the staircase, staring down at his cousin with an expression that might have been shock or might have been something considerably more complicated. Margaret Ashworth had not moved from where she stood on the terrace. Her face had taken on a peculiar greyish quality, and her hands, which hung at her sides, were trembling visibly. "Don't touch him," called out Dr. Gerald Finch, who had materialized from among the guests with the authority that comes from 30 years of being the village physician. He was a competent man, round and greying, with the harried expression of someone who had expected to spend a pleasant afternoon discussing the weather and instead found himself pronouncing death. Nobody is to touch the body. "Has someone called the police?" Thomas Blackwood, the solicitor, was already producing a telephone from his jacket pocket, a newfangled portable device that he consulted as though it were a talisman against chaos. "I'll telephone Inspector Graves immediately. He's at the station today." The crowd began to arrange itself into that particular configuration that crowds assume in the presence of sudden death. Some people moved closer, drawn by the terrible magnetism of tragedy. Others stepped back, as though proximity to death might be contagious. The servants, Mrs. Price, the housekeeper, and James, the gardener handyman, stood together near the door to the house, shock rendering them temporarily useless. It was Mrs. Price who spoke first, her voice still trembling but her years of training asserting themselves over her fear. "He came in about an hour ago, through the front entrance. I was in the kitchen preparing the extra champagne. He said he wanted to change his shoes, said the London ones were giving him blisters. I offered to bring him water, but he said no, he knew his way around, told me to go back to the refreshments." She paused, her hands wringing together. "I should have gone upstairs with him. I should have—" "You couldn't have known," Dr. Finch said, not unkindly. "This isn't your fault, Mrs. Price." But Miss Marple, who had moved closer to examine the stairs without actually touching anything, noted several things simultaneously. The marble step where David's head rested was indeed still faintly warm to the touch. She could feel the residual heat radiating from the stone. There were no signs of blood on the upper steps, only where his head now rested. The angle of his body suggested he had fallen from some distance above, yet his injuries seemed remarkably localized for such a fall. A man tumbling down an entire flight of stairs would typically sustain far more extensive damage. "How many steps is it from the top landing to where he lies?" she asked quietly. Several people turned to look at her, as though noticing her presence for the first time. It was a common enough reaction. Miss Marple had long ago learned that being elderly and unobtrusive made her virtually invisible to most people, which was a tremendous advantage in understanding human behavior. Dr. Finch counted. 12 steps, perhaps 14. Margaret Ashworth had finally moved. She came down from the terrace and stood at the base of the interior staircase, her hand gripping the banister as though it were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. "Who was upstairs?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Besides David, who was in the house?" The question hung in the air like a held breath. The guests exchanged glances. Servants consulted with one another silently. "Only James and I were in the house when Mr. David arrived," Mrs. Price said. "James was washing up the luncheon things in the kitchen. I was preparing things in the pantry." When Mr. David asked to change his shoes, James was still downstairs with me. We both heard him go up the front stairs. And then? Margaret pressed. And then, Mrs. Price's voice cracked, and then there was the sound of him falling, like something heavy tumbling. We thought perhaps he'd dropped something. But then there was nothing, just silence. I went to check, and I found him there, and I screamed, and Inspector Graves arrived 20 minutes later, his motorcar, pulling up the drive with an air of professional inevitability. He was a methodical man of 55 with sharp eyes and the manner of someone who had seen enough of human nature to trust it no further than he could throw it. He examined the body, examined the stairs, and then began the tedious process of examining the guests. Miss Marple waited her turn, which came late in the afternoon, as the sun began to cast even longer shadows across Thornfield Manor. She had positioned herself in the drawing-room, having been asked to wait with the other guests while the initial interviews were conducted. She observed everything, the way Christopher Ashworth kept checking his watch, the way Eleanor Hartley kept touching her throat as though checking to ensure she could still breathe, the way Thomas Blackwood studied the room's doorways, with the expression of a man calculating exits. Inspector Graves settled into the leather chair in Margaret Ashworth's study with the air of a man preparing for a long siege. His notebook lay open on his lap, his fountain pen poised with professional readiness. The room smelled of old books and older money, mahogany shelving, leather bindings, and the faint ghost of pipe tobacco that had lingered long after the pipes themselves had been set aside. "Miss Marple," he began, consulting his notes, "you were present at the garden party from the beginning, I understand?" "I arrived at 2:30, Miss Marple corrected gently. "Mrs. Ashworth had invited me, and I do find that garden parties provide such excellent opportunities for observing human nature in its natural state. Rather like watching birds in a garden, if you will." The inspector looked up briefly, as though uncertain whether this was relevant, then continued. "And you were on the terrace when the scream was heard?" "Yes. I was standing near the stone balustrade, admiring the view. I had my back to the house, actually, so I did not see anyone arrive or depart. But I did notice that the marble step, the one at the bottom of the terrace descent, was rather warm to the touch. Quite unusual for an afternoon like this, don't you think?" Inspector Graves made a note, though his expression suggested he was not entirely certain what to do with this information. "Warm, I see. And did you observe anything unusual about Mr. David Ashworth's behavior when he arrived?" Miss Marple considered this with the deliberate thoughtfulness she brought to all questions. "I noted that Mrs. Ashworth seemed considerably relieved when he appeared. She had been anxious before his arrival. One can always tell by the way a person holds their shoulders, you understand. Once he kissed her cheek, much of that anxiety seemed to dissipate. Though not all of it, mind you. You're very observant," the inspector said, "and it was not entirely a compliment. At my age, observation is about all one has left," Miss Marple replied with a slight smile. "When one cannot move quickly, one learns to look carefully instead." The interview continued in this vein for another 20 minutes. The inspector asked about timings, about who had spoken to whom, about any arguments or tensions Miss Marple might have witnessed. To each question, she provided answers that were accurate but somehow incomplete, observations that raised more questions than they answered. When the inspector finally dismissed her, he looked rather as though he had been engaged in a conversation conducted partly in a language he did not entirely understand. In the corridor outside the study, Miss Marple encountered Eleanor Hartley, who was waiting to be interviewed. The vicar's daughter was pale, her usual composure badly shaken. She gripped a handkerchief in one trembling hand. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice unsteady, "it's dreadful, isn't it? I simply cannot believe that that he's gone. He was so full of life." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "He did seem to be a young man of considerable vitality. Tell me, Miss Hartley, when did you last speak with him?" Eleanor hesitated. "At the garden party. He made some joke about the champagne, something about it being barely acceptable for London standards but adequate for the countryside. We all laughed, though I confess I found it rather unkind." "Did you?" Miss Marple's eyes were gentle but penetrating. "I wonder why. I should have thought a comment like that would be more tedious than unkind." Unless, of course, you had reason to feel defensive about Mr. Ashworth's opinions. Eleanor's cheeks flushed. No, of course not. I simply thought it reflected poorly on his character, that's all. But Miss Marple noticed that Eleanor's grip on the handkerchief had tightened considerably, and that her eyes had developed a peculiar brightness that might have been tears or might have been anger. It was the sort of reaction that suggested Eleanor Hartley had more than a passing interest in David Ashworth's character, and more than a passing sense of having been wounded by him. Later, as evening descended, and the inspector's team began their more technical investigations, Miss Marple found herself in the kitchen with Mrs. Price and James, the handyman. They were being kept occupied with the practical matter of preparing dinner for the household, though no one felt particularly inclined to eat. The inspector had requested that the servants remain available for further questioning, and they had been relegated to the kitchen with an air of sympathetic but firm dismissal. "He was a difficult man," Mrs. Price said quietly, more to herself than to Miss Marple. She was peeling potatoes with mechanical precision, the knife moving in steady strokes that suggested her hands knew their work regardless of what her mind was doing. Not wicked, perhaps, but difficult. He had a way of making people feel small. Young Mr. Ashworth was known for that, then? Miss Marple asked, settling herself onto a kitchen chair with careful deliberation. James looked up from the vegetables he was preparing. He was a man in his 60s, weathered by decades of outdoor work, with the quiet competence of someone who had learned to solve problems without fuss. "He made Mrs. Ashworth unhappy," he said flatly. "Always wanting money. Always some scheme or other. She kept giving it to him, hoping he'd straighten out, but he never did. How much money would you say he wanted?" Miss Marple inquired. The question seemed to surprise both servants. Mrs. Price set down her knife. "I shouldn't speak ill of the dead, but considerable sums. Thousands of pounds over the years. Mrs. Ashworth's solicitor, Mr. Blackwood, tried to advise her against it, said she'd be left with nothing if she wasn't careful." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves in her mind like a puzzle slowly taking shape. Not the full picture yet, but the suggestion of edges, the hint of corners where things might fit together in ways that no one else had quite considered. The night settled over Thornfield Manor with an uneasiness that seemed to permeate the very walls. Inspector Graves had established a temporary headquarters in the dining room, where he and his constable, a young man named Hartley with an unfortunate tendency toward nervousness, had arranged themselves with notebooks and the accumulated weight of official procedure. The body had been removed to the village mortuary, and Dr. Finch had provided a preliminary assessment. David Ashworth had died sometime between 3:30 and 4 o'clock, most likely from injuries sustained in the fall itself, though a more thorough examination would be conducted in the morning. Margaret Ashworth had been given a sedative by Dr. Finch and had retired to her bedroom, her face a mask of shock and something else, something that might have been relief, though Miss Marple suspected that Margaret herself would not have acknowledged such a feeling, even to herself. Christopher Ashworth remained in the drawing-room, drinking brandy with the methodical determination of a man trying to anesthetize himself against uncomfortable emotions. The other guests had been allowed to depart, though the inspector had taken their addresses and made it clear that he would be speaking with each of them again. Miss Marple, who had been offered a room for the night by a Margaret too sedated to properly insist, but too well-trained to refuse, found herself alone in the library shortly after 9 o'clock. The house had settled into an uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional footstep or murmured conversation from the servants' quarters. She had brought with her a volume of poetry from the shelf, something to occupy her hands while her mind worked through the puzzle that had presented itself. The fall that had killed David Ashworth troubled her, not the fact of it. Falls downstairs were common enough among young men who had perhaps consumed too much champagne or were distracted by matters of the mind. What troubled her was the precise nature of the injuries and the timing of events. A man tumbling down 14 marble steps should have sustained far more damage than what Dr. Finch had described. Multiple lacerations, certainly. Broken bones, almost certainly. Yet David's injuries had been remarkably localized. The blow to the head from which he had died, a twisted arm, bruising along one side of his body. It was as though he had fallen in a very specific way, or fallen from a much shorter distance, or or had been positioned after falling. She was turning this thought over in her mind when a soft knock came at the libber. "Airy door." Thomas Blackwood stood in the doorway, his solicitor's face arranged in an expression of formal concern that did not quite mask something deeper and more anxious. "Miss Marple," he said, "forgive the intrusion. I saw the light beneath the door and thought perhaps you might still be awake. Dreadful business, all of this." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, setting down her book. "Please, do sit. You seem troubled, Mr. Blackwood." The solicitor settled into a chair with the careful movements of a man whose body held tension he could not quite release. He was in his early 50s, with grey-streaked hair and the sort of face that years of careful neutrality had rendered somewhat expressionless. Yet tonight, something had cracked in that carefully maintained facade. "I wonder," he said slowly, "if the inspector understands the full picture of the situation here at Thornfield." David Ashworth was not a well-liked young man, Miss Marple, and he had recently become something of a problem for his aunt. "A financial problem?" Miss Marple asked gently. The solicitor looked startled. "You are very perceptive." "Yes, a financial problem." David had come into his mother's inheritance 5 years ago, his mother being Margaret's sister. Rather a substantial inheritance, I'm afraid, £100,000 to be precise. He went through it in 4 years. Cards, bad investments, worse companions. When the money ran out, he turned to Margaret, who has always been indulgent with him. Too indulgent, if I may be frank. "And she has been lending him money?" Miss Marple's tone was not judgmental, merely curious. "Lending, yes, though that is a rather generous term for money that was unlikely ever to be repaid. Over the past 3 years, I estimate he has received approximately £15,000 from Margaret. Her estate is considerable, but not infinite. If this had continued—" He trailed off, but the implication was clear enough. If it had continued, she might eventually have found herself in financial difficulty, Miss Marple finished. "Precisely. And that is the situation I had been advising her about. Yesterday, in fact. I came to Thornfield to discuss the matter. David had written to her requesting another £5,000, which I strenuously counselled her against providing. They argued about it last night. I heard raised voices from the drawing room." Miss Marple absorbed this information carefully. "And did you mention this argument to the inspector?" "I mentioned that there had been a disagreement, yes, but I confess I felt somewhat reluctant to go into details. Margaret is my client, and there are certain confidentialities involved. However, I thought perhaps you ought to know, given that you are—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Given that you have a certain reputation in village matters." This was a delicate way of saying that Miss Marple was known to take an unofficial interest in crimes that occurred in her vicinity, though such things were never discussed openly. "I appreciate your confidence, Mr. Blackwood," she said. "And you are right to be concerned. The inspector will eventually discover these details, and it would be better if they came from you directly, rather than from gossip." After Blackwood had departed, Miss Marple sat alone in the library for some time, the poetry book forgotten on her lap. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to shift and rearrange themselves in her mind. A young man who was a financial burden, an aunt who was reaching the end of her patience and her purse, an argument about money, a fall down marble stairs that seemed almost too convenient, too perfectly timed. But convenience and perfection were often the marks of deliberation rather than accident, and Miss Marple had spent 70 years observing human nature in all its complexity and cunning. She rose from her chair and made her way quietly to her bedroom, her mind already planning the questions she would need to ask, the observations she would need to make. Morning came grey and uncertain, as though the weather itself was reluctant to acknowledge the events of the previous day. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and dressed with the same careful attention she brought to all matters, selecting a dove-grey dress that suggested both propriety and a certain subdued elegance. She found the household already stirring, servants moving about with the quiet efficiency of people trained to continue their duties regardless of tragedy. The machinery of a great house, she reflected, ground on regardless of whether a body lay in its midst or not. Inspector Graves had already established himself in the dining room with fresh tea and the air of a man who had slept poorly and was determined not to show it. His constable, Hartley, looked considerably worse. His eyes had the hollow quality of someone who had spent the night wrestling with thoughts he could not quite vanquish. A telegram had arrived from the county coroner, confirming that a more thorough examination would take place that afternoon, and that preliminary findings suggested death had occurred between 3:15 and 4 o'clock, consistent with the timeline established yesterday. Margaret Ashworth descended the stairs at 9 o'clock, moving slowly as though each step required considerable deliberation. The sedative had worn off, leaving her looking fragile and diminished in a way that daylight seemed to emphasize. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. Christopher sat across from her, his expression a mixture of sympathy and something considerably less charitable, something that looked remarkable, like impatience, though he masked it with the occasional solicitous remark about her well-being. Miss Marple, seated near the window with her own tea, observed this dynamic with great interest. The tension between aunt and nephew seemed to have intensified rather than diminished in the aftermath of David's death. Christopher kept glancing toward the study where the inspector was conducting his follow-up interviews, and there was a quality to his attention that suggested more than mere curiosity. At 10 o'clock, Inspector Graves summoned Eleanor Hartley to speak with him again. The vicar's daughter arrived looking considerably more composed than she had the previous evening, though Miss Marple noted that her composure had the brittle quality of something maintained through sheer force of will rather than genuine equanimity. As Eleanor passed through the dining room toward the study, she caught Miss Marple's eye for just a moment, and in that moment there was a plea of some sort, though whether it was a plea for help or a plea for silence, Miss Marple could not immediately determine. Following Eleanor's departure, Mrs. Price appeared with fresh toast, and the sort of gentle solicitude that only long-time servants could manage. She set the plate before Margaret with a murmured, "You must eat something, ma'am, to keep your strength," and then, as she turned to leave, paused beside Miss Marple's chair. "May I speak with you for just a moment, Miss Marple?" she asked quietly. "In the kitchen." The kitchen was warm and slightly steamy, smelling of bread and the peculiar comfort of working fires. Mrs. Price closed the door carefully behind them, and then turned to face Miss Marple with the air of someone who had made a decision and was determined to see it through before her courage abandoned her. "I lied yesterday," Mrs. Price said without preamble. "Not entirely, but enough. When the inspector asked about who was in the house, I said it was only myself and James, but that wasn't quite true." Miss Marple waited with the patience of someone who had learned that silence was often the best encouragement for truth. "Miss Eleanor was here," Mrs. Price continued. "She arrived perhaps half an hour before the garden party ended. She came through the side entrance, the one near the conservatory. She said she wanted to speak with Mr. David about something, said it was personal and important. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Young people are always having personal conversations, but when I heard the sound of Mr. David falling, and then when we found him, I remembered that Miss Eleanor was still in the house somewhere. I found her in the conservatory, looking quite pale and upset." "And did she explain her presence?" Miss Marple asked. "She said she had heard the commotion and had come to see what was happening. But Miss Marple, I didn't believe her. She looked as though she'd seen a ghost, and her hands were shaking terribly. She asked me not to mention that she'd been in the house, said it would cause unnecessary talk, and I agreed. I shouldn't have, but I did." This was, Miss Marple reflected, precisely the sort of complication that made investigation so fascinating. Mrs. Price had acted out of a misguided sense of protection, either for Eleanor or for the household itself. It hardly mattered which. The result was that a potentially crucial piece of information had been hidden from the inspector, which meant that the picture he was constructing of events was incomplete and therefore potentially incorrect. "Why are you telling me this now?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Because I've been thinking about it all night, and it troubles me, and because I saw the way you looked at things yesterday. Careful, like you were seeing more than what was. Just there on the surface. If something wrong has happened, if Miss Eleanor is in some sort of difficulty, Then perhaps it's better that someone who understands people knows the truth." Mrs. Price paused. "Is it wrong of me to have kept silent?" "Not wrong," Miss Marple said. "Human. But the truth, Mrs. Price, has a way of emerging regardless of how carefully we try to conceal it. And sometimes the kindest thing we can do for those we care about is to let that truth come into the light." After Mrs. Price had returned to her duties, Miss Marple stood alone in the kitchen, considering this new complication. Eleanor Hartley had been in the house. Eleanor Hartley had been upset. Eleanor Hartley had concealed her presence from the police. The question, of course, was why. Miss Marple found herself at something of a crossroads, a position she had occupied many times before in her life, though rarely with such serious implications. She possessed information that the inspector did not have, and the ethical weight of that knowledge pressed upon her with considerable force. There were, she reflected, protocols for such situations. One informed the authorities, one allowed the machinery of law to function as it was designed to function. Yet she also knew from experience that the machinery of law, for all its efficiency, was sometimes blind to the subtler currents of human motivation that moved beneath the surface of events. She decided, therefore, to undertake a small investigation of her own before deciding what information to share with Inspector Graves. The conservatory of Thornfield Manor was a marvel of Victorian engineering, a glass-roofed structure filled with exotic plants that Margaret had collected over decades of comfortable widowhood. Orchids hung from suspended brackets, their delicate blooms suggesting both fragility and a certain defiant beauty. Ferns clustered in shadowed corners. A small fountain trickled quietly in the center of the space, its water falling over smooth stones worn by years of use. Miss Marple moved through the conservatory slowly, examining everything with the careful attention of a woman searching for something she could not quite name. The floor was of terracotta tile, somewhat dusty, though clearly swept recently. Footprints marked the dust in several places, the servants moving about their duties presumably, but near the western corner, where a particularly magnificent orchid collection was displayed, she found something interesting. A small scrap of pale blue fabric caught on one of the ornamental iron brackets that supported the plants. She did not touch it, merely noted its presence and its position. Eleanor Hartley, she recalled, had been wearing a pale blue dress at the garden party yesterday. Leaving the conservatory, Miss Marple made her way to the servants' stairs and climbed to the upper landing where David Ashworth had met his end. The marble steps were cordoned off with rope, a constable stationed at the top to prevent curious handling of the scene. He recognized Miss Marple, and, with the indulgence granted to elderly ladies by young policemen, allowed her to examine the stairs from a distance. She stood at the top of the flight and looked down. 14 steps, as the inspector had said, descending from the upper landing to the entrance hall below. The light from the tall windows near the front door illuminated the steps clearly, making every imperfection in the marble visible. She examined the point where David's body had been found, the middle landing, and noted again the peculiar nature of the injuries Dr. Finch had described. A man would have to fall in a very specific way to sustain such injuries. A man would have to, or a man might sustain such injuries if he had been struck, rendered unconscious, and then positioned to appear as though he had fallen. The thought crystallized in her mind with the cold clarity of certainty. What she was seeing was not the accident it had been made to appear, but rather a carefully orchestrated attempt at disguise. Someone had wanted David Ashworth dead and had chosen to make it appear as though his own carelessness had killed him. The question was who, and more importantly, why. She was still contemplating this when Eleanor Hartley herself appeared on the landing below, having apparently finished her interview with the inspector. The young woman started visibly upon seeing Miss Marple at the top of the stairs. "Miss Marple!" Eleanor exclaimed, moving up a few steps before stopping, as though uncertain whether to continue. "I didn't realize you were... What are you doing here?" "Simply examining the scene," Miss Marple said mildly. "One can learn so much from observing the places where events have occurred. And how are you bearing up, my dear? This must be a tremendous shock for you." Something flickered in Eleanor's eyes. Fear, perhaps, or the shadow of a terrible secret being held just barely in check. "It's dreadful," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "Absolutely dreadful. Poor David. Whatever his faults, he didn't deserve to die." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "though I confess I'm curious about what brings you to Thornfield this morning. You weren't staying here, I believe?" Eleanor hesitated. The pause stretched between them like a taut wire. "I came to speak with Margaret about something that had been troubling me, a personal matter." "Not with David, then?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle, almost conversational, as though she were asking about the weather. There may have been a matter I wished to discuss with David as well," Eleanor admitted, her face flushing. "But I didn't get the chance. When I arrived, I was told he was at the garden party. I went to find him there, and then everything happened so quickly." This was not entirely true, Miss Marple sensed, though it contained elements of truth woven through with careful omission. Eleanor had been in the house. Eleanor had been upset. Eleanor was now engaged in the delicate dance of partial revelation that suggested someone with much to hide and limited confidence in her ability to hide it. "The inspector seems to believe that David's death was an accident," Miss Marple observed. "A tragic fall while he was alone in the house." "Do you think that's accurate, Miss Hartley?" Eleanor's face went quite white. I'm not certain what you mean." "I think you understand me perfectly well," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. "And I think you are laboring under the weight of a secret that is becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Such burdens have a way of crushing those who carry them, my dear. Sometimes the merciful thing is to set them down." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I can't tell anyone what I know. It would hurt someone I care about very much, more than the truth hurts?" Miss Marple asked. "Or perhaps you believe that protecting someone through silence is an act of love. I've found, in my experience, that such protection is often rather misguided." Before Eleanor could respond, the constable called out that the inspector wished to see Miss Marple in the study. The moment had passed, and Eleanor's secret, whatever it was, remained locked behind eyes too frightened to speak it aloud. Inspector Graves looked up from his notebook as Miss Marple entered the study, his sharp eyes betraying a certain wariness. He had learned, over the course of his career, that elderly ladies with observant natures and time on their hands could be either tremendously helpful or tremendously inconvenient, and he had not yet fully decided which category Miss Marple fell into. "Miss Marple," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite his makeshift desk. "I wanted to ask you a few additional questions, if you don't mind. Nothing to be alarmed about, simply following up on some details that have come to my attention." Miss Marple settled herself with the careful deliberation that suggested her joints were not entirely pleased with the process of sitting. "Of course, Inspector. I'm happy to be of whatever assistance I can provide. You mentioned yesterday that you observed Mrs. Ashworth's anxiety before her nephew's arrival. I'm wondering if you might expand on that observation. What specifically did you notice?" Miss Marple considered the question with the thoughtfulness she brought to all matters. Her hands trembled slightly when she was pouring tea. She glanced repeatedly toward the path leading to the house, as though expecting someone. There was a tightness about her mouth that suggested she was anticipating something unpleasant. "These are small things, Inspector. The sort of things one notices when one has spent 70 years observing people, rather than engaging in more active pursuits. And when her nephew arrived, this anxiety diminished." "Partially," Miss Marple confirmed. "Though I confess I wondered if it was truly anxiety that dissipated or merely anxiety of a particular type, perhaps anxiety about whether he would appear at all, replaced by anxiety of a different sort." The inspector made a note, then looked up with renewed interest. "You're suggesting that Mrs. Ashworth might have been anxious about her nephew's arrival for reasons other than simple familial affection?" "I'm suggesting nothing, Inspector," Miss Marple said with a slight smile. "I'm merely reporting what I observed. The interpretation of such observations is, I believe, your province rather than mine." What Miss Marple did not mention, at least not yet, was the scrap of blue fabric in the conservatory, or the conversation she had overheard between Thomas Blackwood and Margaret Ashworth the previous evening, a conversation that had taken place after she had supposedly retired to her room. She had been, in fact, in the library retrieving a book she had left behind, and had heard raised voices coming from the study. She had not deliberately eavesdropped, but neither had she covered her ears against what she heard. Margaret's voice, sharp with an emotion that might have been anger or might have been desperation. "I cannot do this any more, Thomas. I simply cannot. There has to be an end to it." And Blackwood's response, measured and professional, "Margaret, you must understand what you're saying. If you cut him off entirely, the consequences could be severe. More severe than continuing to be bled dry by a man who will never change. More severe than watching everything my husband built be frittered away on the whims of a selfish, ungrateful boy." Miss Marple had retreated quietly to the library at that point, unwilling to be discovered in her accidental eavesdropping. But the conversation had provided a crucial piece of context. Margaret had reached the end of her patience and her resources. She had been prepared to do something definitive about her nephew's financial demands. "There is one other matter," Inspector Graves continued, interrupting her thoughts. "Miss Eleanor Hartley has now admitted that she was in the house yesterday, contrary to what she stated initially. She claims she came to speak with Mrs. Ashworth about a personal matter. Have you any idea what that matter might have been?" Miss Marple chose her words with great care. "I would not wish to speculate about the private concerns of a young woman, Inspector. However, I did observe that Miss Hartley and Mr. David Ashworth seemed to have some history of acquaintance. Whether that history was romantic in nature, I could not say with certainty, but you suspect it was. I suspect many things, Inspector. The difference between suspicion and certainty is considerably wider than many people imagine." The inspector leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that suggested he was trying to determine how much of what she was saying was genuine observation and how much was deliberate obfuscation. "You're a rather difficult woman to interview, Miss Marple. You seem to see a great deal but reveal very little." "At my age, one learns that revelation without proper foundation is a recipe for injustice," Miss Marple replied. "I prefer to observe, to listen, and to allow the full picture to emerge before drawing conclusions." After she had been dismissed, Miss Marple made her way to the morning room where Margaret Ashworth was resting. The older woman looked diminished by grief and something else. A weariness that suggested the accumulated weight of years of difficult decisions had finally become too much to bear. She was staring out the window at the garden, her hands folded in her lap, her expression distant. "Mrs. Ashworth," Miss Marple said gently, settling herself into a chair nearby, "I hope you don't mind my intruding upon your solitude. I wanted to express my sympathy for your loss." Margaret turned to look at her, and for a moment Miss Marple saw something raw and anguished cross her features. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly. "Though I confess I'm uncertain how to feel. David was my nephew, but he was becoming a considerable burden. One is not supposed to admit such things, especially not now, when he's dead. But it would be a lie to pretend otherwise. The truth," Miss Marple said, "is often more complicated than propriety allows us to express. But I wonder, Mrs. Ashworth, if you might tell me about the conversation you had with Mr. Blackwood yesterday evening? The one about cutting off David's financial support?" Margaret's face went very still. For a long moment she did not speak. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "How did you know about that?" "I was in the library," Miss Marple said simply. "I did not mean to overhear, but I did. And I think perhaps that this information may be important to the inspector's investigation. More important, perhaps, than either of us initially realized." Margaret Ashworth's composure, which had been carefully maintained throughout the morning, finally began to crack. Her shoulders sagged and her hands, which had been folded so precisely in her lap, began to tremble. She rose from her chair and moved to the window, her back to Miss Marple, presenting only the rigid line of her spine and the grey of her hair caught in the pale afternoon light. "You must understand," Margaret said, her voice thin and papery, "that I loved him. Whatever David became, whatever he did, he was my sister's son. When she died, when Patricia died, I promised myself that I would look after him, that I would be the mother he no longer had. But he took that love and he twisted it. He used it." "Tell me about the conversation with Mr. Blackwood," Miss Marple said gently. Not because I am judgmental, but because I believe it may be relevant to what happened yesterday. Margaret turned to face her, and her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. Thomas came to me yesterday afternoon before the garden party began. He had been examining my accounts, you understand. That is his responsibility, as my solicitor. He informed me that at the current rate of David's demands, I would be financially ruined within 5 years. Ruined, Miss Marple. Everything that my late husband built, everything that generations of Ashworths had accumulated, would be squandered on a man who had no gratitude and no sense of responsibility. And what did you decide? I decided that it had to end, Margaret said flatly. I told Thomas that when David asked for money this time, and he was certain to ask, he always asked, I would refuse. I would give him one final sum, enough to settle his most pressing debts, and then I would be done. No more money, no more enabling his destructive behavior. He would have to learn to stand on his own feet or suffer the consequences. And did David know of this decision? Not yet. I had planned to tell him after the garden party. I had planned to be firm, to be kind, but absolutely resolute. But then... Margaret's voice broke. Then he fell down the stairs and everything changed. And now I'll never know if I would have had the courage to follow through. I'll never know if I would have let him manipulate me one more time, as he always did. Miss Marple listened to this confession with the careful attention it deserved. There was genuine anguish in Margaret's voice. But there was something else as well, a strange undercurrent that suggested the woman was relieved even as she mourned. The loss of a burden, however much one might have loved that burden, often brought with it a complicated mixture of emotions. Mrs. Ashworth, Miss Marple said slowly, I must ask you something, and I ask it not out of accusation but out of necessity. When David went upstairs to change his shoes, did anyone go with him? Margaret's face went very white. No, he went alone. At least, that's what I thought. But now you're wondering if someone else was in the house, someone who might have had their own reasons for wishing David harm. Before Margaret could respond, there came a commotion from the Del Way, raised voices, the sound of someone being escorted urgently through the house. Inspector Graves appeared in the doorway of the morning room, his expression grim, and behind him came Christopher Ashworth, his face pale and his hands clenched into fists. I have something to tell you, Christopher said, his voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. Something I should have told you yesterday, but I was afraid. I was afraid it would look wrong, would make me seem like a suspect. But I can't keep quiet anymore. Sit down, Inspector Graves said, not unkindly, and Christopher collapsed into the nearest chair. Eleanor came to see me yesterday, Christopher said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Before the garden party ended. She was terrified. She said that David had been blackmailing her. He had photographs, compromising photographs taken at a house party in London last year. He was demanding money to keep them secret. She had come here to plead with him to destroy them, to show him mercy. But he laughed at her. He told her that if she didn't pay him £200 by the end of the week, he would send the photographs to her father, the vicar. Miss Marple felt the final piece of the puzzle slide into place with terrible clarity. Eleanor, desperate and frightened, had been in the house. Eleanor had confronted David about the photographs. Eleanor had something very real to lose if those images were revealed. Eleanor had reason enough to wish him dead. Where is Miss Hartley now? Miss Marple asked quietly. That's the other thing, Christopher said. She's gone. Her mother came looking for her this morning, and Eleanor's not at home. She left a note saying she was going away for a while, that she needed time to think. No one knows where she is. Inspector Graves was already moving toward the door, already calculating his next steps, but Miss Marple remained, perfectly still, her mind working through the implications of what she had just learned. Eleanor had motive, certainly. Eleanor had opportunity. But there was something that didn't quite fit. Something about the nature of the injuries and the careful staging of the scene that suggested something more premeditated, more calculated than a desperate young woman acting in panic and fear. No, the real killer was still here, still walking freely through Thornfield Manor, still waiting for the perfect moment to let suspicion fall on Eleanor and away from themselves. The search for Eleanor Hartley consumed the afternoon and evening, with constables spreading out across the village and surrounding countryside in a methodical sweep. Inspector Graves had issued a description to the railway station and had alerted neighbouring police forces. By all appearances, he was treating Eleanor as a suspect who had fled in fear of arrest, which was precisely what someone had wanted him to believe. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced. She sat in the library as evening fell, a cup of untouched tea growing cold at her elbow, and turned the facts over in her mind with the precision of someone arranging the pieces of a particularly intricate jigsaw puzzle. Eleanor had motive, yes. Eleanor had been in the house, yes. But Eleanor did not have the cold calculation that this murder required. This was not a crime of passion or desperation. This was premeditated, carefully planned, designed to appear as an accident and to cast suspicion on the most obvious suspect when that appearance began to fail. The scrap of blue fabric in the conservatory suddenly took on new meaning. Eleanor's dress had been blue, but so, Miss Marple recalled with sudden clarity, had the dress worn by someone else at the garden party. A dress glimpsed only briefly, a figure moving quickly through the crowd, a woman whose presence had registered in Miss Marple's observant mind, but whom she had not consciously noted until this moment. Margaret's lady's maid, Miss Catherine Wells, was a woman of 35, with dark hair, and the kind of severe beauty that comes from having endured a difficult life without allowing it to soften her edges. She had worked at Thornfield for 6 years, and was known in the village as a woman of quiet competence and even quieter secrets. Miss Marple had observed her at the garden party, moving about the periphery of events with the invisibility granted to servants, and she had been wearing a pale blue dress, not her usual grey uniform, but a dress nonetheless, which suggested that Margaret had given her permission to dress as a guest rather than a servant for the afternoon. An unusual privilege, Miss Marple reflected. An unusual privilege for a woman of Margaret's generally rigid sense of propriety. She rose from her chair and made her way quietly to the servants' quarters, where the household staff was preparing dinner in an atmosphere of tense speculation. Catherine Wells was working in the scullery, her hands immersed in soapy water, her face composed but her eyes betraying a certain brittleness that suggested her composure was maintained only through considerable effort. "Miss Wells," Miss Marple said softly, approaching the girl quietly so as not to startle her. "I wonder if you might spare me a moment." Catherine's hands stilled in the water. She did not turn around immediately, but when she did, her expression was carefully neutral. "Of course, Miss Marple. Shall we step outside?" They moved into the kitchen garden, away from the other servants, into the gathering dusk where the herbs released their evening fragrance into the cooling air. Catherine's shoulders seemed to relax slightly once they were alone, as though the effort of maintaining her facade had become exhausting, and she was grateful for permission to abandon it, at least temporarily. "You loved him," Miss Marple said. "It was not a question—" Catherine's laugh was bitter and brief. "Love? What an interesting word for it. I suppose you could call it that. Mrs. Ashworth took me in when I had nowhere else to go. She gave me employment and a roof over my head when I was desperate. I was grateful to her, more than grateful. But David—" Catherine's hands clenched into fists. "David saw a woman who was vulnerable and alone, and he exploited that. He seduced me, promised me things, made me believe that he cared for me. And then, when I became inconvenient, he simply cast me aside as though I were nothing." "And when did you discover that you were with child?" Miss Marple asked gently. Catherine's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. But the shock quickly gave way to a kind of resigned acknowledgement. 3 weeks ago. I told David when he arrived yesterday. I thought perhaps he would do the right thing, that he would marry me or at least acknowledge the child. But he laughed. He actually laughed and told me that it was my own fault for being foolish enough to believe his promises. So you confronted him on the stairs? Yes. I waited until he came up to change his shoes, and I confronted him. I pleaded with him. I told him that a child was coming, that he had a responsibility. And Catherine's voice broke. He told me that he had no intention of taking responsibility for anything, least of all a child born to a servant he barely remembered. He said he would deny it all, that no one would take my word against his. He said I was a fool. And then, Miss Marple prompted gently, and then I lost control. I pushed him. I didn't plan to hurt him. I just wanted him to stop talking, to stop being so cruel. He fell backward, and his head struck the marble. I thought he was only stunned at first, but when I went to help him up, I realized he wasn't breathing, and I panicked. Catherine sat down heavily on a garden bench, her entire body seeming to collapse under the weight of the truth she was finally speaking aloud. I didn't know what to do. I tried to revive him, but he was already gone, and I knew that no one would believe it was an accident. I knew that everyone would assume I had killed him deliberately. So I arranged him on the stairs to make it look like he had fallen on his own. I wiped my hands on my dress, and I went back downstairs, and I tried to act as though nothing had happened. But something had happened, Miss Marple said softly. A life had been ended, and a new life had lost its father before it was even born. He deserved to die, Catherine said fiercely, then immediately regretted the words. No, that's not true. He was weak and cruel, but he didn't deserve to die. And now, she looked up at Miss Marple with eyes full of anguish. Now they're hunting Eleanor. Innocent Eleanor, who did nothing except be caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I've let them do it. I've hidden behind the accident story and let them suspect her. Miss Marple reached out and placed a gentle hand on Catherine's shoulder. The truth, she said, has a way of emerging regardless of how carefully we try to conceal it. And sometimes, the kindest thing we can do is to help that truth come into the light before more innocent people are destroyed by darkness. Inspector Graves received the confession with the composed demeanor of a man who had spent decades collecting the complicated truths that lay beneath the surfaces of human lives. He sat across from Catherine Wells in the study, his notebook open before him, his expression neither accusatory nor sympathetic, merely professionally attentive. Constable Hartley stood nearby, his earlier nervousness replaced by the focused concentration of a policeman performing his duty. "Walk me through it again," the inspector said, his pen poised over paper. "Beginning from when you learned about the pregnancy?" Catherine's voice, which had been steady in the garden with Miss Marple, now wavered slightly as she recounted the events to official authority. But she persisted, laying out the sequence of her desperation and her fatal moment of rage with a clarity that suggested she was relieved, finally, to set down the burden of secrecy. The inspector listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, occasionally asking for clarification about timing or details. It was, Miss Marple reflected from her position near the fireplace, a confession that contained elements of both truth and careful construction. Catherine had indeed pushed David. Catherine had indeed lost control. But there was something in the way she described the moment that suggested a woman not entirely certain whether her actions had been accident or something approaching inevitability. When the confession was complete, the inspector rose from his chair and instructed Constable Hartley to escort Catherine to the village police station, where she would be held pending formal charges. As Catherine was led away, her shoulders slumped in a posture of complete defeat, Miss Marple caught her eye for just a moment. In that moment passed a silent acknowledgement. Catherine had confessed to protect Eleanor, and Miss Marple had been the instrument of that confession's emergence. But the case was not yet closed, not entirely. As Inspector Graves was preparing to file his preliminary report, Miss Marple requested a private word with him. They settled in the library, the room that had become something of a sanctuary during the investigation. Surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of centuries bound in leather and cloth, "Inspector," Miss Marple began, "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's observations. There are several aspects of this case that trouble me." The inspector, who had been under the impression that the case was essentially resolved, looked up with renewed interest. What sort of troubles, Miss Marple? Catherine's confession is substantially accurate, I believe. She did confront David, she did lose control and push him, but I'm not entirely certain that the fall which resulted was as accidental as she has portrayed it. You see, the angle of his injuries, the precise nature of his head wound, these things suggest a man who fell in a very particular way. Not a man who tumbled helplessly down a flight of stairs, but a man who fell more vertically than forward. You're suggesting what, precisely? I'm suggesting that Catherine may have pushed him at precisely the right moment to ensure a fall that would result in fatal injuries. I'm suggesting, Inspector, that what began as a moment of rage may have transformed, in that crucial second, into something more deliberate. A woman might know, in an instant of terrible clarity, that by pushing rather than restraining, she could solve a problem that had become unbearable. The inspector set down his pen and regarded Miss Marple with an expression that was difficult to read. You're describing a murder, not a manslaughter. I'm describing the moment when human beings sometimes cross a line they didn't know existed until they stood upon it, Miss Marple corrected gently. Catherine may not have decided consciously to kill David, but she may have known, in that instant when her hands touched his back, that pushing him would result in his death, and she may have pushed him anyway. That would make it murder, the inspector said flatly. Yes, it would. Inspector Graves was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the arm of his chair. If I pursue this line of reasoning, if I suggest to a jury that Catherine Wells acted with deliberate intent rather than in the heat of passion, I would need considerably more evidence than speculation about angles and injuries. Dr. Finch's examination would provide that evidence, Miss Marple suggested. If you asked him specifically to look for signs that the fall occurred in a particular direction, he would likely find them. The human body, Inspector, leaves marks of its own story if one knows how to read them. After the inspector had departed to telephone Dr. Finch, Miss Marple remained in the library, reflecting on the complicated nature of justice and human motivation. Catherine Wells had loved a man who was incapable of returning that love. She had carried his child. And in a moment of desperation, she had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The truth was, Miss Marple knew, that Catherine had likely convinced herself that it was an accident. The human mind was capable of extraordinary feats of self-deception when necessary. Catherine would probably spend the rest of her life genuinely believing that she had not meant to kill David, even if the physical evidence suggested otherwise. That ability to rewrite one's own actions, to convince oneself of a version of events that was more palatable, was perhaps the most human of all capacities. The following morning, Eleanor Hartley was brought back to Little Hampstead by two constables who had tracked her to a small boarding house in the neighboring town of Ashford. She had gone there, she explained, because she needed time to process the shock and shame of David's blackmail. She had no knowledge of his death until the police arrived at her door. Inspector Graves released her with a prologue. Ease, though the apologies were somewhat stiff, as though he was not entirely accustomed to admitting error. The village's collective attention, which had been focused on Eleanor as the presumed guilty party, now shifted to Catherine Wells, and in that shift came a different sort of judgment. Not the judgment of suspicion, but the judgment of sympathy and complexity. Mrs. Ashworth received the news of Catherine's arrest and confession with a composure that suggested she had, in some way, anticipated something like this. She arranged for Catherine to have legal representation, and she ensured that provisions would be made for the unborn child. It was, Miss Marple reflected, the action of a woman who had come to understand that love sometimes required accepting the terrible consequences of human weakness and desperation. The trial of Catherine Wells took place on a grey November morning, 3 months after David Ashworth's death had disrupted the peaceful routines of Little Hampstead. The courthouse was filled with curious villagers, journalists from the regional papers, and the general apparatus of justice that descended upon small communities when they found themselves at the center of a crime that could not be ignored or quietly resolved. Miss Marple sat in the gallery, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the proceedings with the same careful attention she had brought to the garden party where it all began. The prosecution presented its case methodically, Dr. Finch testified that the angle of David's skull fracture suggested a fall from a standing position directly downward, rather than a tumble down multiple steps. The evidence of Catherine's pregnancy was presented with clinical precision. Letters were produced in which David had made promises to Catherine that he subsequently denied making. The physical evidence of the blue fabric caught on the cons. Arbitrary bracket was introduced, placing Catherine definitively in the house at the time of death. Catherine's defense attorney, a competent man from London named Morrison, argued passionately for manslaughter rather than murder. He presented Catherine as a desperate young woman, pregnant and abandoned, whose momentary loss of control had resulted in tragedy but not premeditation. He called character witnesses who testified to Catherine's gentle nature, her kindness to the household staff, her general unfitness for deliberate violence. It was a compelling argument, constructed with considerable skill, but Miss Marple, watching Catherine's face as Morrison spoke, saw something in the young woman's expression that suggested the defense was not entirely accurate. Catherine's eyes held a quality that went beyond regret or shame. There was in those eyes a terrible knowing, the knowing of someone who had crossed a line and could not, regardless of what any jury might decide, uncross it. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, their verdict was guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The judge, a man named Caldwell with the weary expression of someone who had spent decades witnessing human frailty, sentenced Catherine to 8 years' imprisonment. As the sentence was pronounced, Catherine stood motionless, as though she had expected precisely this outcome and had long since made peace with it. After the trial concluded, Miss Marple found herself walking through the village with Margaret Ashworth, who had attended every day of the proceedings. They moved slowly, 2 elderly women navigating the grey afternoon with the deliberate pace of those for whom time had become a precious and finite resource. "Do you believe she deserves 8 years?" Margaret asked quietly. "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Catherine Wells made a choice in a moment of desperati. And that choice resulted in a death. Whether that choice was fully conscious, or whether it occurred in the space between thought and action, is something only Catherine truly knows. And perhaps," Miss Marple added, "only Catherine will ever truly know." They walked in silence for a time, their footsteps the only sound in the quiet village street. The autumn leaves drifted down around them, nature's reminder that all things, even the most difficult and painful things, eventually gave way to seasons of renewal. "I have made a decision," Margaret said finally. "I have established a trust fund for Catherine's child. The money will be held in care until the child comes of age. I thought it was the least I could do, given that my nephew was responsible for the circumstances that led to what happened." Miss Marple patted Margaret's arm gently. "That is a generous and wise decision. It suggests that you have learned something from this terrible experience." "I have learned," Margaret said slowly, "that love can be both a kindness and a cruelty, depending on how it is expressed and received. David's weakness was not entirely his fault, but neither was it my responsibility to enable it indefinitely. And Catherine deserved better than what David offered her. We all deserved better." They parted ways at the edge of the village, Margaret returning to Thornfield Manor and Miss Marple making her way to the cottage where she had lived for the past 40 years. That evening, as she sat by her fire with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of truth and its relationship to justice. The official version of events was now set in stone. Catherine Wells had lost control in a moment of desperation, had pushed David Ashworth, and the resulting fall had killed him. She had been sentenced and would serve her time, and eventually she would be released to continue. Her life, changed irrevocably by the consequence of her actions. But Miss Marple knew, with the certainty that came from a lifetime of observing human nature, that there was more to the story than what the jury had concluded. Catherine had not simply lost control. In that instant on the stairs, Catherine had made a choice, not a reasoned choice, not a planned choice, but a choice nonetheless. She had known as her hands touched David's back what would happen if she pushed him, and she had pushed him anyway. It was a subtle distinction, one that would have been nearly impossible to prove in a court of law. but it was a distinction that mattered, because it was the difference between a crime of passion and a crime of desperation transformed into something approaching intention. Catherine would live out her sentence, carrying the weight of that knowledge, knowing that in an instant of clarity she had chosen to end a life rather than accept the consequences of continuing to live with her unbearable situation. Justice, Miss Marple reflected, as she set down her knitting and gazed into the fire, was not always clear or simple. Sometimes it was a matter of degrees, of shades of grey that defied the black and white verdicts of courts and juries. Catherine Wells would spend 8 years in prison, and then she would be released into a world that might or might not accept her. She would live with the knowledge of what she had done, and that knowledge would be its own form of punishment, continuing long after her official sentence had been served. The marble steps of Thornfield Manor would continue to be walked upon by generations of visitors and inhabitants. Life in Little Hampstead would return to its ordinary rhythms, and Miss Marple, the small elderly woman who had observed it all with such careful attention, would continue her quiet life, knitting and gardening and observing. The endless complexities of human nature with the patience and understanding that came from having spent 70 years learning to see what others overlooked.